Today we bring you the second of two programs with Neil Armstrong. In 1963, he was transferred to astronaut status. He served as command pilot for the Gemini 8 mission, launched March 16, 1966, and performed the first successful docking of two vehicles in space. In 1969, Neil Armstrong was commander of Apollo 11, the first manned lunar landing mission, and gained the distinction of being the first man to land a craft on the moon and the first man to step on its surface. This interview was conducted by Stephen Ambrose and Douglas Brinkley. It was recorded September 19, 2001 at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas.
Let's, when we move into the early Apollo program, and the Apollo program started off with a tragedy. Can you share with us how the AS-204 Apollo 1 fire affected you personally, if you have any memories of that?
Oh, yeah, I remember it very well, and I've known Gus for a long time. Ed White and I bought some property together and split it. I built my house on one half of it, and he built his house on the other. We were good friends, neighbors. Yeah, those are very, very traumatic times, and you know, I suppose you're much more likely to accept loss of a friend in flight, but it really hurt to lose him in a ground test. That was, you know, it was an indictment of ourselves. I mean, we did it because we didn't do the right thing somehow, and that's doubly traumatic.
Were you involved in the investigation of what occurred? Did you start looking into it?
No, I was not. If I remember correctly, Frank Borman was involved in the leadership of that investigation.
There's some people that say that tragedy in many ways started helping get a better sense of focus and discipline with NASA and exactly what it would take to make a lunar landing. Did you find a change of more of some of the around NASA in general, the more seriousness of intent, a more triple checking of everything before taking nothing for granted?
Partly that. Secondarily, and perhaps even more importantly, we were given a gift of time. We didn't want that gift, but we were given months and months to not only fix the spacecraft, but rethink all our previous decisions, plans, strategies, and change a lot of things, and hopefully for the better. So, same thing happened after the Challenger explosion. We got time, and they fixed a lot of things that needed to be fixed, and they never had time to do it before. So we get an added benefit, but we regret the price we had to pay.
Yeah, let me interrupt for this second. Test pilots are losing friends often. Yeah. And you must have lost some friends.
Many.
Yes. But you hit me hard with that. This was on the ground.
Yeah. That's not the way you want it to happen.
I'm sorry.
Not that it's any less noble.
Yeah.
Because it isn't.
No, of course not.
It just hurts.
Yeah.
Just wondering how the Apollo missions were different from the previous ones, the training for them, now that you're in the Apollo program, especially since the possibility was that you're training for the moon. How did the training change?
Was the same in that it was very goal-oriented and we tried to define it as narrowly as we can. rather than as broadly as you would in research, because with the time constraints that we were facing and the desire to get there as fast as we can, we were in a race, and that was very evident to us all the time. We wanted to not be diverting your attention in any way to things that you really did not need to worry about. You want to focus on all the things that you knew you had to do and had to master. Well, that was the principal difference as we went into the Apollo flights.
First up on the Apollo 1, on the tragedy, do you remember where you were when?
I was in Washington. There was a president was signing the treaty with other nations that kept the moon as the property of all people. It was the non-staking a claim treaty.
So you were there at the White House?
Yeah, I was at the White House. I think it was at the White House. I believe it was.
The ceremony, and then suddenly the news came through to everybody there, or on your way out? Was that?
It was. I think it was after this ceremony, but I don't remember exactly how we.
And you were with a group of people representing NASA that had come up to be part of the ceremony, and then you got the news, and then you came back to Houston after you got the news? Or?
Probably the next day. Yeah, that's a bit hazy.
No, that's helpful to put you in place. I think how did you react when you first learned of NASA's decision to send what was then Apollo 8 to the moon? Do you recall? I mean, the feelings of which one of these was going to go to the moon? So they're talking about sending Apollo 8 to the moon.
We were very excited about it. We thought it was very bold because we still had the Progo problem on Saturn, and we'd had a couple of problems with the few Saturn V launches. So to take the next one and without those problems being demonstrated as solved, and put a crew on it, and not just take it into the orbit, to take it to the moon, it seemed incredibly aggressive. But we were for it. I mean, we thought that was a wonderful opportunity, and if we could make it work, why, it would give us a giant jump ahead. You remember, it was kind of complex. We had to switch crews around and switch some spacecraft and change the order completely, and it was kind of a complex process, but it showed a lot of courage on the part of NASA management to make that step.
What was the impetus for that decision to speed it up to that degree?
The lunar module was falling behind, wasn't ready to fly, and they were saying, "What can we do? We've been in Earth orbit. What can we do without a lunar module?" And I don't know which minds first came up with the idea of, well, why don't we think about a circumlunar flight with it? Leave the lunar module behind.
What immediate new concerns would somebody like yourself have? And let's just say that you're a pilot, a top flight pilot would have about leaving Earth's immediate gravitational influence. What would frighten a pilot about that?
Well, I suppose that everyone would have concerns, but I don't know that they'd all be the same. People would worry about different things. I remember that one of the things that that I was concerned with at the time was whether our navigation was sufficiently accurate that we could, in fact, devise a trajectory that would get us around the moon at the right distance without, let's say, hitting the moon on the backside or something like that. And if we lost communication with Earth for whatever reason, could we navigate by ourselves using celestial navigation? We thought we could, but these were undemonstrated skills.
Well, you got me thinking about you didn't have a very big window to look out of to do celestial navigation.
We did have we're probably the only, NASA's probably the only organization in history that's been sold a one-power telescope. That's what we used for doing the sextant shots and doing the star stuff.
What were your thoughts when you were finally, and where were you? I'm sorry, sometimes I try to put things in locations of it personally, but what were your thoughts and where were you when you were chosen for the lunar landing mission for Apollo 11 when you first got the word?
It was during the flight of Apollo 8.
While it was up there.
Yeah, and during the flight of Apollo 8, I had 3 or 4 meetings with first, would I take the third one down, and then we had a lot of talks about who might be available and be right to be on that crew and that sort of thing.
So you participated in a discussion of who?
Yeah.
It was his decision, but he wanted your input.
Absolutely.
And if it were, and Collins and Aldrin were 2 of the people you thought would be.
Yeah, we didn't have very many choices, but we had several other people that we could make available, and so we spent a lot of time talking about that.
And how well?
Wait, and what characteristics mattered? Level-headedness, quick-wittedness, eye-hand coordination,
Experience,
general knowledge, experience,
and what things people were particularly skilled at, had some knowledge or flight experience related to those jobs, and so on. And there were other considerations, like if we switch things around too much, well, you're going to get other people's nose out of joint because they stole somebody from somebody else's crew. I mean, there were a lot of, typical kinds of things that you would.
personality.
Sure, we talked about those things. Yeah, talked about everything that you might expect. Yeah.
You must have been quite touched that he slightly asked you about that. Must have made you, my goodness, this is happening now. The excitement, the reality that this could be the big moment.
Well, it was going to be a big moment, no matter what the flight objective was, but there wasn't any way we'd know what it was going to be at that point in time.
Right.
Because the lunar module had not flown, hadn't even been in Earth orbit. We didn't know if we could communicate with 2 vehicles simultaneously at lunar distance. We didn't know whether the radar ranging would work. A lot of things we just didn't know at that point. And I think at that point in time, I did not really expect that we'd get the chance to try a lunar landing on that flight. There's too many things could go wrong on 8 or 9 or 10 or whatever.
And what was your relationship? Did you know Collins and Aldrin fairly well before this assignment?
I'd never worked on a crew with them, but part of the time I had in the early days of Apollo 8. Michael was first on that flight. And I had not worked with Buzz. So But I'd known him pretty well because in total we were still a pretty small group. We knew some of the people a lot better than others because we worked with them a lot and spent a lot more hours in the middle of the night testing spacecraft. But you get to know each other very well in these periods.
Who ended up picking the names Eagle and Columbia for your spacecraft? And what symbolism do you feel?
The crew, as a crew, did that. We all participated. I think Mike probably was as convincing as anyone, and as we deliberated on what we.
Was it one of your fun recreational things, like making a list of what we should call them, kind of a little bit?
We had lots of those little things which we considered to be non-operational decisions.
Yeah.
They were kind of a pain to have to deal with all those, but we had to do it.
A name beside that you preferred to the Eagle and the Columbia that you could?
No, I thought we came up with the right ones.
While we're on the naming, and these are famous names, of course. It was Winston Churchill who picked Overlord.
Was it?
Yeah. And then how did they get Sword, Juno, Gold, Utah, and Omaha Beach?
Yeah.
They drew them out of the hat.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Well, once the decision had been made that Apollo 11 would be the first one to attempt the lunar landing, how much emphasis did the mission planners and manager place on public relation issues? How much of your time was consumed with how are we going to market this to the American public, both for for all the reasons that you?
I didn't think there was very much of that. There were some things that were done specifically for the benefit of giving the press the opportunity to either talk with us or take pictures of our activities in preparation. And there were other normal things that we were doing where some access was granted. And we probably resented that to some extent, but at the same time we recognized that it was not an unreasonable requirement, and we were certainly willing to accommodate those requirements.
Did you find the intense media focus disrupting, a disruptive force in any way, or that for your concentration or training?
Well, it might have been a burden if we'd had time to notice it. But we were going full blast, trying to be ready on time, and we just tried to shut anything out of our mind that wasn't focused on our principal objective.
If you would, describe your training with the Lunar Landing Research Vehicle and the Lunar Landing Training Vehicle. What was it like to try to fly it, and how valuable was that experience during your mission?
Start at the end and work back. It turned out to be very valuable. Originally, when they started first talking about lunar landing, and wasn't known what technique would be used to go there, I was at Edwards, and we started thinking about how you would simulate flying over the moon. And that was a natural thing for us because in-flight simulations was our thing out at Edwards. We did lots of in-flight simulations, tried to duplicate other vehicles or duplicate trajectories, or duplicate this or duplicate that, make something fly like something else. That was just what we did. Don Bellman and Gene Matranga, two engineers, and and myself, to some extent, started talking about how you might do this. And our first idea was for if we ever needed for training, was to have the spacecraft, and we didn't know what the spacecraft would look like, have the spacecraft carried on another vehicle and make that other vehicle be something that would create the conditions that would duplicate the lunar gravity and lunar vacuum and so on. Then our thought was, when the vehicle gets built, we can put it on top of this carrier, and they can actually fly it just like they would over the moon, and they could do it at Edwards or wherever, and learn how it flies. Then we decided that was going to be a pretty complicated project, and what we should do before we did that was build a little device, little one-man device, which would just investigate the qualities and requirements of flying in the lunar, to build the database from which we would build the bigger thing to carry the real spacecraft. So we actually devised such a craft. It looked like a tin Campbell soup can sitting on top of some legs with a gimbal engine underneath it, and that became the basis for what went out as a requirement for bid to build the LLRV, Lunar Landing Research Vehicle. It was not known at this time that there would be a lunar module. It was a direct descent and Earth orbiting, rendezvous, and other strategies were still being considered. Matter of fact, the lunar module came after the Lunar Landing Research Vehicle. Fortunately, the characteristics and the size and the inertias and so on of this training device were very much like the lunar module, and that was strictly fortuitous. And so it turned out that the people, this is after I had left there, Joe Walker, Don Malik, and so on, went through the project of flying this thing and finding out what the characteristics of a machine flying in a lunar environment would be. And subsequent to that, or at that time, it was decided to go the lunar orbital rendezvous method and build a lunar module. And it turned out that was just about the right size.
Yeah.
After that, they made the lunar landing training vehicle, which was designed to be even more LEM-like, so that would give you a good representation, and in fact it did. And all the pilots, I think, to my knowledge, everyone thought it was an extremely important part of the preparation for the lunar landing attempt. And you may know the lunar landing, the lunar module was designed to be able to make an automatic landing, but to my knowledge, no one ever did.
So the simulation, how close a simulation was this training to the actual landing? I mean, did you feel it was almost, were you in for any surprises when you actually had to land it differently than what your simulation?
It was harder to fly than the lunar module, more complicated, and subject to the problems that wind and gusts and turbulence and so on introduced that you don't have on the moon. And the systems were somewhat choppier or less smooth than the actual lunar module. Both propulsion and attitude control systems were. So the lunar module was a pleasant surprise.
You might discuss the incident you had with the Lunar Landing Research Vehicle when it crashed, and what was your involvement in the investigation and recovery process in that? Did you be part of all of that?
Well, it's fairly well covered in a variety of documents. Just say that for unknown reason, the pressurant gas I was conducting a simulated lunar approach and lost the pressure and gas to the attitude control rockets. And when you lose attitude control, why it slowly just diverges, not very slowly. And there was very little time to analyze alternatives at that point. It was just because I was so close to below 100 feet in altitude. So just, again, time when you make a quick decision, you departed. I did not participate in the investigation of that because I had otherwise assigned duties at the time, so others did that. So we lost 3 of those vehicles, and it was a contrary machine and a risky machine, but a very useful one.
How did your training for Apollo 11 differ from the training for Apollo 8? And just briefly, if you could, just what did your training consist of?
Well, on the training part of our activities, the addition was the lunar module, which we had not had on Apollo 8. So, Michael Collins spent all of his time mastering the command module. Buzz Aldrin and myself focused a great deal of our time on mastering the lunar module, knowing it inside out, and then we had, of course, to learn the experiments and the lunar surface science work and the installation of equipment on the moon and all that kind of stuff, which took a lot of time. And I suppose we would have liked a little more time, but when the time came, we had to say, yeah, we were ready to go.
Were there any specific incidences during the training for Apollo 11 that made a significant impact on you or your crew members or your mission, something that occurred during the training that when you were in space and heading to the moon really was of extraordinarily beneficial nature? I know there are many things that were. I was wondering if something.
Oh, yeah, there were a lot of complexities. We were most concerned with mastering the times, like when we separated the vehicles, and making certain that the computer knew what the velocities and directions of each vehicle were before and after that separation. It's a very difficult, complex procedure to make sure the computer isn't fooled somehow or loses information in that process. And then the navigation system was dependent on the alignment of the inertial unit, and we were and that any time once you turn that loose, it drifts at a very slow rate. So we wanted to be sure that it didn't drift outside limits and find procedures that we could use to confirm that we would still have adequate quality navigation information to complete the lunar landing. That's I'm afraid it's a complex subject that's not easily described, but from the time we last aligned the platform until landing was some substantial number of hours, and so we wanted shortly before landing to confirm that platform hadn't drifted off too far. That was our attitude reference. So we took a sunshot, had the computer point us at the sun, our telescope at the sun, and make sure that it cut the sun just exactly through the middle, If it didn't, why the error would be due to the alignment of the drift of our navigation system. A lot of little things like that, which were extremely important and painfully tedious, but absolutely necessary.
How did you cope as the flight day got closer and closer with the just overwhelming interest that developed for the Apollo flight and the first man on the moon, and the crowds of people everywhere, the whole world watching? Here you are, the young man whose wife planes from Ohio that's kind of through all these programs. How do you numb out all of those external forces that are happening all around you? Just experience, and she taught you.
I don't know the answer to the question. We tried to provide some information that would allow that public exposure to the kinds of things we were doing, and beyond that, when those things were done, we just turned back inwards to our own problems, our own schedules, our own list of things that we had to get done, and get a confidence level that we were ready to go. So we just sort of shut that out, that all the time that was outside those spaces that we specifically allocated to the public exposure.
To follow up on Doug's question, I don't know if it was the most anticipated event of the 20th century. There have been a lot of events in the 20th century, and many of them have changed the world and so on. But nobody knew that Hitler was going to invade Poland. Hitler and his general staff knew it, but nobody else in the rest of the world knew it. Nobody knew about Pearl Harbor except Yamamoto and a few pilots. Nobody knew about last Tuesday except a small handful of people. This had to have been just about the most anticipated event, maybe even ever. I was trying, a heavyweight boxing champion going into Muhammad Ali versus Frazier. There's a lot of pressure on those guys and a lot of build-up, and they've got to learn to do exactly as you just said. You just got to freeze it out, and you've got to, and you look at their eyes when these heavyweight boxers come in, and that concentration is total. But you went through the most anticipated, because it was so anticipated, the most. And yet what you said reminded me of Muhammad Ali. This wasn't a sporting event or anything else, but I don't know what the hell else you do, except you just try to screen it all out and concentrate on what. And I'm trying to put words in your mouth, and I don't mean to do that. But.
Well, I think you're right. We tried to be as focused as we could, work on the things we could do something about, and not worry about the things that were beyond our ability to change.
Did you, if you could really capture yourself back to as the day clock's ticking for takeoff, would you every night or most nights just go out quietly and just look at the moon? I mean, as if it became something like, my goodness.
No, we never did that. We'd look at the books, or we'd talk about strategies, or what are we going to do if this happens, or are you sure you know how to handle this? And that's where we spend our time.
A lot of what if talk.
Yeah, that's our business. And normally you get a lot of unexpected things happen, and usually they're not the ones you practice. But the fact that you practiced a lot of different things puts you in the proper mindset to handle whatever it is that comes along, even if it isn't the one that you've experienced before. And I think that happened on a lot of the flights.
Yeah.
Did you develop a relationship of studying the moon as the maps of the moon as they were at the time, and like learning everything you could about its makeup? And I mean, part of your reading, if you're not just looking at the moon, but really kind of become an expert on the moon? Or wasn't that
Well,
important?
we'd been doing that part of it now for 3 or 4 years, working on this background information. In the last months before flight, we didn't do much of that except to look specifically at our landing areas and landmarks and things that we would actually be using or to which we would be referring during the progress of the flight. So those things we looked at, but the broader picture we didn't spend much time on.
I think we're almost ready to blast off. Maybe we ought to take another break before we blast off.
Okay.
You think?
Sure.
Yeah.
I was curious if you had any geological. I guess I was getting to this in the question about the moon itself, but did NASA require geological training for the Apollo 11 mission, or so you could notice things that you might see, or was?
Yeah, we spent a lot of time in geology training, predominantly before we had a flight assignment, not exclusively before, but predominantly before.
Thank you.
Had very fine group of instructors, very knowledgeable about the subject of astrogeology or selenology or the various things that might most be applicable to what we might encounter on the lunar surface. Some had the opportunity and the interest to become very good geologists. I never put myself in that category. I enjoyed geology, and it was certainly appropriate to understanding what we were seeing on the surface of the moon. But our time was quite limited there. We had a lot of things to do, and had I been a better geologist, I might have seen some things that were important that I missed. And if that's true, I regret it. But the time we had available, I think everyone did a pretty credible job of being able to see things that were important and know which samples to pick up and be able to describe to people back on Earth what they were seeing. Certainly the knowledge of the lunar surface has increased immensely as a consequence of those observations and those samples. And of course, as you know, that work continues yet today in labs around the world.
Or was there a debate whether you would find water on the moon? Was that something that you was?
There was not an expectation that we would, and I don't remember what our thinking might have been in looking for things that might disclose the possibility of either past or hidden water. I just don't remember that very well.
Let me ask a layman's question on this. Now I understand there is some feeling in NASA that there may be water on the moon. The question is, how could there be water without clouds? If there's water, there's going to be clouds. It seems to me.
If it's the thinking is if it's in perpetual darkness, that is in a crater, polar crater, or a low spot, so that it never sees the sun, sublimation rates will be extremely low, and there might be bodies of water there, and there's some spectral data that indicates that that may be true, but it's not yet proven to my knowledge.
Was there anything about the takeoff Apollo 11 launch that was different than from the feeling that I'm talking about just the immediate seconds after launch that was different than other missions you were on?
Yes, it was a couple of things. One is the acceleration is at a very low G level. Starts at, I don't know, I think less than half a G. I've forgotten exactly, but it appears to be quite rapid. But it would be less than, substantially less than the acceleration of a rock that you dropped. So it's kind of a slow ascent. The thing that surprised me, and we knew this ahead of time, that attitude control in space, to pitch the craft, you use say you wanted to pitch up, you would use a down-pointing rocket in the front and an up-pointing rocket in the back, and that would pitch the craft up. But we didn't want any rockets firing up when we were accelerating away from the moon, because that would be wasting fuel. So we would only use the down-pointing rockets because they would be adding to our velocity. And it would be fuel efficient. But the result of that is that there's a substantial rocking motion as you pitch forward. The pitch-up thruster fires, lifts your nose up, then it stops, then the nose falls down again, and the rocket fires, and so you're in a rocking chair. Now, we knew this, but the simulators never included this in their representation of the motions. And so, consequently, it's quite an unusual, I thought, quite an unusual motion. And I perhaps I should have expected it, but we'd never seen it in our preparation.
How serious a concern was there over contamination on your return to the Earth? Was that something you, not just from NASA, but yourself, how serious was that concern?
I don't know that I can say. As you know, I think it was the National Academy of Science was given the task of evaluating the potential danger from lunar contaminants on the Earth, and it was they who, I think, said the chances are extremely unlikely, and they gave a statistic which I won't attempt to quote because I'm sure I'd have it wrong at this point. Nevertheless, they decided to go ahead and have a decontamination facility and put us in quarantine for a period of time equal to the expected incubation time of any disease that could provide an epidemic, 21 days from the time we left the surface of the moon till they left us out. As you know, they used samples of the soil and put it in soil that plants were growing in and exposed it to animals and various kinds of things to see if there were any reaction whatsoever. I don't know to what extent they found anything, but certainly if they found anything, it wasn't serious. And after a couple of flights with that quarantine, they discontinued that protection system.
During the actual landing on the moon, when the program alarms sounded, what was your reaction? How did you respond?
You're always concerned when any kind of alarm comes on, but it wasn't a serious concern because there wasn't anything obviously wrong. The vehicle was flying well. It was going down the trajectory we expected. No abnormalities in anything that we saw other than the computer said there's a problem and it's not my fault. And the people here on the ground were right on top of that. And of course, the computer continued in a contrary manner there periodically all the way to the surface. But My own feeling was that as long as everything was going well and looked right, engine was operating right, ahead control, and we weren't getting into any unusual attitudes or things that looked like they were out of place, I would be in favor of continuing no matter what the computer was complaining about.
It's not just you're talking about your experience and duty and propelling this mission forward. There's a real chance of death and failure here, and not just failure for your death for yourself and failure for the United States, the whole world watching this kind of mission.
Yeah.
Did you read that lately they released that Nixon had William Safire write a death letter about what would happen if the three astronauts died on this mission? Did you have a chance to see that document?
I have heard that, but I have not seen it.
Is that you just have to numb yourself from that kind of concern of the grandness of all this? I guess what I'm saying is Apollo 11, due to the, as Steve said, perhaps most watched event in the history of certainly the century of the world. How does you didn't treat it differently mentally at all as you would something one of your previous missions?
We're certainly aware that this was the culmination of the work of 400,000 people over a decade, and that the nation's hopes and outward appearance largely rested on how the results came out. With those pressures, it seemed the most important thing to do was focus on our job as best we were able to, and tried to allow nothing to distract us from doing the very best job we could. And I have no complaints about the way my colleagues were able to step up to that.
Let me interject here that you share a quality with General Eisenhower. When reporters would come to him during the war, and I want to get a story, they said, go talk to Bradley. Go talk to Patton. Go talk to a sergeant. That's where the real story is. This is a team effort. And he would never allow it to concentrate on him. It was inevitable that it was going to happen, but that was his. And then after VE Day, Churchill arranged a big event in London that Eisenhower went to be awarded the key, I think the keys of the city, but you're now a citizen of London.
Mm-hmm.
And all of this concentration on Eisenhower. And in his speech, he talked about the closeness between Abilene and London, which was a nice touch. We all believe in freedom and we're going to fight for it and so on. But he also said, if I'd have had the wisdom of Solomon, if I'd have had the character of Lincoln, I never could have done any of this by myself. This is a team effort. And you just spoke about the hundreds of thousands of people that have been working for so long to make this happen. And I invite you to make a reflection on the team nature of the Apollo 11 mission.
Well, each of the components of our hardware were designed to certain reliability specifications. And far the majority, as to my recollection, had a reliability requirement of 0.99996, which means that you have 4 failures in 10,000 operations. I've been told that if every component met its reliability specifications precisely, that a typical Apollo flight would have about 1,500 separate identifiable failures. In fact, we had more like 150 failures per flight. 10 times better than statistical methods would tell you might have. And I can only attribute that to the fact that every guy in the project, every guy on the bench building something, every assembler, every inspector, every guy that's setting up the tests, cranking the torque wrench and so on, is saying, man or woman, if anything goes wrong here, it's not going to be my fault because my part is going to be better than I have to make it. And when you have hundreds of thousands of people all doing their job a little better than they have to, you get an improvement in performance, and that's the only reason we could have pulled this whole thing off.
Let me invite you to also make an observation, if you wish. It is a part of the popular culture that anytime the government gets involved in a project, they're going to screw it up. Talking to Moore this morning, I was thinking about some of the great events of this century, or the 19th, or the 20th century, or the 19th century. The atomic bomb, the Lewis and Clark expedition, the Louisiana Purchase, Dr. Salk. It's almost always the government that gets behind this. And you certainly, on Apollo 11, were at the very cutting edge of an enormous spear. It was built by the government. And I would just wonder what comments you might or might not have on that.
When I was working here at the Johnson Space Center, then Manned Spacecraft Center, you could stand across the street and you could not tell when quitting time was, because people didn't leave at quitting time in those days. People just worked. And they worked until whatever their job was done, and if they had to be there till 5 o'clock or 7 o'clock or 9:30, whatever it was, they were just there. They did it. And then they went home. So 4 o'clock or 4:30, whenever the bell rings, you didn't see anybody leaving. Everybody was still working. And the way that happens, and the way that may be different from other sectors of the government, to which some people are sometimes properly critical, is that this was a project in which everybody involved was, 1, interested, 2, dedicated, and 3, fascinated by the job they were doing. And whenever you have those ingredients, whether it be government or private industry or a retail store, you're going to win.
One of the, I guess probably the question we must get tired of the most is the most famous words of the 20th century, and that's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. And maybe you've answered this question so many times before, but do you find it curious that NASA didn't script a line for you to say, that they allowed you the kind of personal freedom to I almost, if I put myself in that situation, I would have almost wanted to say, Neil, here's the line we'd like you to say when you get to the moon. They gave you that.
Well, in retrospect, they might have wished that. But the late Julian Scheer, who really led the NASA relations with the outside world in many ways. Was absolutely adamant that headquarters never put words in the mouth of their people, not just astronauts, but anybody. That they let people speak for themselves. They made it known sort of what the party line was and what the NASA position was, but beyond that, they never, to my knowledge, controlled the statements, public statements of others, and certainly they insisted in the case of the flight crews that they not be told what to say, and that the statements of the crew be their own elocution of what they saw and what they wanted to say. And as far as I know, that prohibition was never violated.
And with you actually crafting that line, that was just something you were thinking about as the moment approached when you knew this was going to happen? Did you think about in your head, did you think maybe I should just say man is now on the moon, or did you realize, I think that's a magnificent line. I think most people do. Everybody, I really think, does. I mean, how did that come about? Where you had some time while you were getting prepared for to leave the Eagle, that you knew that would be the proper line or the line you wanted to say?
Yeah, I thought about it after landing, and because we had a lot of other things to do, it was not something that I really concentrated on, but just something that was kind of passing around subliminally or in the background. But it was a pretty simple statement, and talking about stepping off something, why it wasn't a very complex thing, and it was what it was.
But as Doug said, everybody in the world knows the line, and everybody in the world are so grateful that you didn't say that's one giant leap forward for the United States.
And you get, I guess now you must realize, how often that news clip of you descending the television image, when you see that now, this many years later, that image, does it still affect you in any way? Like, wow, that's me back then?
No.
And when you crafted the line and you were coming down, how much of a concern is that? You had a lot of things running, also you're hoping just to get that footprint put on the moon. I guess
I didn't think of it as being as important as others. Didn't want to be dumb, but I contrived in a way, and I was guilty of that.
When you were on the moon, there are not that many photographs of you on the moon. But they seem to be much more of Buzz Aldrin. That's because you were taking more of the photographs?
He's a lot more photogenic than I am. Yeah, I had the job of taking a lot of the pictures. That was part of my assigned responsibility. So, and each of us there was a short time in the middle where I transferred the camera to Buzz, and he took some pictures, and we each had assigned objectives that we were supposed to catch, and I think we probably caught a fair share of the things we were supposed to take pictures of, and not too many really bad shots.
I'm struck by coming down. There had to be a lot of wonderment, a lot of excitement as you took that last step onto the lunar surface. But then you guys went to work, and insofar as there are critics, they've said, why did we send men to the moon? We should have sent up machines to gather up the things. I'm struck by something you said earlier about when you're talking about geology, There's no computer in the world that can match the human eye and the human brain. And things that you saw that you hadn't expected to see, that's what we're doing. I mean, there's no machine in the world can do that.
Machines are getting better and better, but fortunately there's still a place for us, Homo sapiens. Some reason for us to continue to exist.
Well, two things. I mean, I guess we should mention, we jumped the story a little, but when the landing occurred, you had a pilot to make sure that you didn't go into a crater. How damaging would that have been if you couldn't and you landed in? Would that have been the end of the mission?
We could have tried to land there, and we might have gotten away with it. It was a fairly steep slope, and it was covered with very big rocks, and just wasn't a good place to go. If I'd run out of fuel, I would have put down right there. But if I had any choice of a more promising spot, I was going to take it. And there were some attractive areas, far more level, far less occupied by boulders and things, half mile ahead or so. So that's where I went. I wanted to make it as easy for myself as I could on that first. There's a lot of concern about coming close to running out of fuel, and I was very cognizant of that. But I did know that if I could have my speed stabilized and attitude stabilized, I could fall from a fairly good height, perhaps maybe 40 feet or more, and in the low lunar gravity, the gear would absorb that much fall. So I was probably less concerned about it than a lot of people watching down here on Earth. And that's not to say I wasn't thinking about it, though, because I certainly was. But I thought it was important to try to get it down smoothly on the first try. We didn't know how that landing was actually going to go until that point, so I wanted to make it as gentle as I could.
Is there anything about your moonwalk and collecting of rocks and the like that surprised you at that time when you were on the moon? Like, I did not expect to encounter this. I did not expect it to look like this. Included in that, the view of the rest of space from the moon must have been quite an awesome thing to experience.
I was surprised by a number of things, and I'm not sure I can't recall them all now. I was surprised by the apparent closeness of the horizon. I was surprised by the trajectory of dust that you kicked up with your boot, and I was surprised that even though logic would have told me that there shouldn't be any, there was no dust when you kicked. You never had a cloud of dust there. It doesn't exist. That's a product of having an atmosphere, and when you don't have an atmosphere, you don't have any clouds of dust. I was absolutely dumbfounded when I shut the rocket engine off, and the paths of particles that were going out radially from the bottom of the engine belt all the way out over the horizon. And when I shut the engine off, they just raced out over the horizon and instantaneously disappeared. No, just like it had been shut off for a week. And that was remarkable. Never seen anything like that. And logic says, yeah, that's the way it ought to be there. But I hadn't thought about it, and I was surprised.
And the collection of rocks that you gathered and things those were pretty much what you expected. There was nothing there.
We didn't do a very good job, and I particularly didn't do as good a job as I would have liked to have done in collecting rock samples. It was at the end of our period on the surface, time period. We were running low on time, and the geologists properly would have liked us to authenticate each sample with photographs from different directions and before selecting it and identify it. And I thought, since we didn't have time to do it, the better part of valor was to just pick up all the different kinds of samples I could as quickly as I could, stick them in the bag, and get them back in the craft and button up shop.
When the American flag is planted on the moon, and the famous photograph of, I suppose, Aldrin was looking at life and other places, but is that just reflect on how important did you feel at that point in any? I know it's so hard to put you back in that moment, but this was now the mission was accomplished, that the United States had gone to the moon, that all this work had counted. But in other words, there's a sense of patriotism with the flag there in the United States. On the other hand, you're looking at Earth as not as one unity, and there's sort of a pride of American nationalism, but also the sense of, geez, we're all on that little planet in the sky together.
There were a lot of proposals for what to do on the lunar surface by different people. Some people thought a UN flag should be there, and some people thought there should be flags of a lot of nations. In the end, it was decided, and I think the Congress had something to do with it, that this was a United States project, and we're not going to stake a claim here, but we ought to let people know that we were here, and we would put a U.S. flag. And my job was get the flag there. I was less concerned about whether that was the right artifact to place. I'd let other wiser minds than mine make those kind of decisions, and I had no problem with it.
When you finally, I guess, what was the most harrowing part of Apollo 11? Was it getting the lunar module off the moon, to reconnect with Michael Collins? Is that the part of the mission that you were most concerned about?
Well, take that in two steps. Fortunately, there were no really harrowing parts of the flight. The most difficult part from my perspective, and the one that gave me the most pause, was the final descent to landing. It was far and away the most complex part of the flight. The systems were very heavily loaded at that time. The unknowns were rampant. The systems in this mode had only been tested on Earth and never in the real environment. There were just 1,000 things to worry about in the final descent. It was, I think, it was hardest for the system, and it was hardest for the crews to complete that part of the flight successfully. But having said that, it wasn't too hard because six crews were successfully able to do that. So perhaps my concern at that point was more than it should have been. But it was the thing that I worried about, just because it was so difficult. Walking around on the surface, on a 10 scale was a 1, and I thought that the lunar descent on a 10 scale was probably a 13.